Okay guys, now let's talk about how we're going to graph a secant when we have that in an equation. Remember, don't worry about what the secant's going to look like to start with. Let's think about its reciprocal instead. So I'm going to treat this like a cosine equation. Graph my cosine, and then I'll do all my reciprocal values to get the secant. When we go to do the amplitude, we are technically graphing the secant, so I want to leave it infinite or none. But when we go to do this cosine, we'll go back to this value of -2 to help us figure out where our points are going to go and where our amplitude of cosine is. The period for secant is just like for cosine. It's 2 pi over b, or 360 over b. I see a 90 in this equation, so I'm going to use this in degrees and do 360 over 2 for the period, which would be 180. For my horizontal shift, still c over b, 90 over 2. Since it's positive in the equation, then we will be moving this 45 to the left. And then that vertical shift is that +1 at the end, so we'll be moving that midline up 1. Okay, so plotting our points, I'm going to start by figuring out what is on my x-axis. Now, start with that horizontal shift. We're moving at 45 left, so I actually want to start at -45. Since the period is 180, that final point is going to be 180 away from that. So -45 plus 180 is 135. Okay, now the middles. Adding -45 and 135 together gets me 90. Half of that is 45. And then the middles of both of those sections. So again, add them together, divide by 2. I've got a value at 0. Add those together, divide by 2, and we've got a value at 90. So those represent the 5 places we're going to plot a point for cosine, which will then turn into secant. Okay, y-axis is going through 0. On my y-axis, again, cosine would have a vertical shift up 1. So that is where my midline will be. And then the amplitude, of course, for secant is infinite. For cosine, it's 2. So up 2 to 3 and down 2 to -1. So I'm going to go ahead and plot my points for cosine. It is a negative in front, so our cosine is going to be flipped over. So where normally cosine would start at that maximum, we're going to flip down and start it at that minimum. Then hit the midline, up to the top, midline, and down to the bottom. So cosine would look something like that. Okay, now let's adjust to show the secant instead. Anywhere cosine is hitting that midline, in this case it's at 0 and 90, then secant is going to have an asymptote. So there are the asymptotes for the secant. That minimum point for cosine stays the same, and then that section will flip down for secant. The maximum point of cosine stays the same, and then flips up. And then I have another minimum to flip down. So in red we have one cycle or one period of cosine, and then in the blue would be the corresponding secant.